there's often from business colleagues, let's just throw it to legal and legal will sort it out. But you can't review contracts in a vacuum. So I will then maybe have a call and say, talk to me about the business side of this. Why does this matter? What's the history here? What's the context? And then walk them through what matters in the contracts in relation to that history and context. And that's actually one of the parts that I find most fulfilling is that ability to both educate the team, but then also work together because again, the legal part doesn't exist alone and the business part doesn't exist alone. So how do you find that balance so that you're able to meet what the business's needs are? I love that process.
I'm so excited to have you.
Thank you, Laura. It's such a pleasure to be here as I'm a huge fan of you and all the resources and information you share. So really delighted to be here today.
That's wonderful. And we just realized that we've never actually talked in person over a video conference, despite having a ton of interaction the last couple of years. So this is a great day for me as well. What I want to start with is a little bit about you, and if you can tell us a little bit about your career and what you're doing and all of that.
Sure. I'm an associate general counsel at a Fortune 500 company that supplies automotive safety products to basically every car company that you could imagine. If you've been in a car, probably one of the products is in there seat belts, airbags, and other safety features. And really just a corporate generalist in that role. So doing everything from contracts to compliance, data privacy, just a huge range of things. And I'm based in Japan and it's a Swedish company, a global company. And prior to this role, which I've been in for about 3.5 years, I was at MoFo for 15 years, which is, we have that MoFo connection. And
Yeah. And MoFo is Morrison and Foerster for those who don't know it and think we're using the slang instead of that
oh,
MoFo
that's
for.
right. Yeah, sometimes you forget that there's this other meaning, but we mean the law firm MoFo, Morrison Foerster.
Exactly, exactly. This podcast is all about the learning journey for contracts and how you came to contracts, how you learned about it. For me, my first exposure was in law school in a contracts class first year. What was your view of your contracts class and contracts in law school?
My contracts class was all theory. I had the big red case book and all those cases where you learn about the basics of offer and acceptance consideration and did not see a single contract. Definitely not in my first year. Don't think really in any part of my law school experience. So that seeing an actual contract where you're thinking about what does this mean and how do we change it happened much later on in my legal career.
Yeah, for me as well. I graduated and never saw anything. The first time I was like, oh, this is what they look like. It was
Right.
crazy. So after law school, you moved on and found a job. Did you work at a firm right out of law school?
Yep, out of law school, I was a summer associate at MoFo. So MoFo was the only firm that I'd been to before my current role.
And you ended up going into the litigation group.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Tell us a little bit about what kind of cases you worked on and how that went.
Yeah, I was mainly in the product liability group, I guess officially, but I ended up becoming similar to my role now, a generalist. So I did a lot of different types of commercial civil litigation. So whether that was intellectual property or also did a lot of investigations and compliance work. And really, I just happened to follow the things that interested me at any given time. And the people I would have discussions with partners, and they might be saying, "Oh, I'm working on this case." I'm like, "Oh, that sounds interesting. Do you need some help?" And suddenly I'm learning XYZ new area of law and diving into that. But primarily just, yeah, just big litigation.
That's the fun part of being in these big firms is you do have that flexibility to move around and follow the work and work with people that you like within the firm. I always like that about MoFo too. So as you're working on these big cases, did you ever deal with contract disputes as part of that? And what kind of things did you see and how did you approach that and learn about contracts as part of that process?
Yeah, my experience with contracts was basically with disputes. So you've got commercial dispute of sometimes millions and millions of dollars litigated over a single clause, a single word, the interpretation of that ends up with companies not seeing eye to eye and going through some third party, a court or arbitration to help resolve that. And because of that experience, I have to tell you that I came away just hating contracts with a passion because it was like, all of this work that went into this contract, and now here we are spending millions of dollars to sort it out. And from that experience. I enjoyed the litigation aspect of it, but I think, I don't know, in my head, it was just, I just can't believe we're spending all this time on this, which are very important matters at the end of the day for the businesses. But the fact that it came down to these words that maybe people weren't, probably weren't foreseeing, they must not have been able to
Right.
foresee how these words could play out 10 years later when you don't have the same parties that drafted it around. And then you've got people trying to rebuild the story on both sides of the case. And then you got your third party, whether a court or arbitrators, to interpret it all and resolve it. Yeah, it made me like contracts very much, to be honest.
I think there's a lot of people who have that experience too. And that's where they come to contracts and they don't see it the way I see it, which is this is so much fun. We get to
Yeah.
help the business and we're doing all these cool things. But I think and I worked at MoFo as well in tech transactions for 5 years and did a lot of those kinds of mega deals that were super critical, cutting edge, huge amounts of money at stake. And there's a different experience with contracts when you work on those. And I will tell you, I did not like working on those at all. Did some over the years where I'd have to do the big deals, but my entire career, I love working on the smaller mid-sized deals because there's an expectation that everything's not perfect. And that's okay. Nobody needs it to be perfect when it's not that huge bet the company contract. And we're all just get the deal done, move to the next one and all that kind of stuff. I think a lot of people share your experience.
Yeah. And well, I'm glad to say that now, being on the other side of things, not the everything's gone south and nobody's getting along and now we've got to resolve it in court. I'm now on the other end where two businesses have a common goal and how do we figure this out? We want to do business together. We want things to work out well. And so how do we have some agreement that documents that and allows us to move forward with it? It's a completely different mindset that I definitely didn't get that image of, have an understanding of, again, on the litigation dispute side of it.
Now, how did you get to the point, apart from just finding the right resources, which I know you appreciated the how to contract resources, but even apart from that, how did you figure out how to do those contracts since you hadn't done them before? It's a lot more than just looking up resources and checklists. It's really navigating on a day-to-day basis, which is such a different and challenging experience. So if you can tell us about kind of showing up and conquering this subject that was relatively new for you.
Yeah, I think there are probably 3 main categories, main resources that I had. One is my boss, who is amazing, and she's been at the company for, I think, about 7 years, and I think she had a similar experience of going from a firm to in-house, and now we've got this business contract before you, and what do you do? So she definitely mentored me and helped me to figure out how do we evaluate, what level of risk, and et cetera. That was one. Another was that some of my former colleagues essentially gave me like a one-on-one tutorial of here are all the things that you need to know about contracts. And
Yeah.
I reached out and this was like, I'm reviewing all these types of agreements and it would just be helpful. And they gave me the nuts and bolts, and I still carry a lot of that wisdom with me. And then third was you, Laura Frederick, and everything that you do. I naturally came across your posts on LinkedIn, bought the first How to Contract book, one of the initial members of the How to Contract platform. And it was literally the perfect timing that you were releasing that. I remember had this email or DMs back and forth on LinkedIn, and I told you about myself. Oh, I was at MoFo. We had that in common. And now I'm moving in house. And you mentioned, hey, I've got something coming out that might be helpful for you. And it was everything that I needed. And so came to the point where if I'm reviewing a contract, even if I feel comfortable about the area of the contract, like whatever topic it is, I might just go and look and say, what does Laura say about this? What are the other things that I should be thinking about and taking into consideration for this review? Yeah, you just helped me so much in the role that I do every day. Thank you.
Well, thank you. No, thank you for sharing that. And it's been so fun for me to be able to work for 25 years doing all this stuff. And I remember before I took this journey on, was like, that would be really bad if I had all this knowledge because I just done commercial contracts my whole career and I just retire. I need to do something with this. And so what I tell people is I just captured what so many of us know who have been doing it a long time, but it's not written down anywhere. So it's been great to be able to do that and share that with people and just play that role with helping people figure this stuff out. So as you were figuring out, and I wanted to talk about the folks who walked you through that contract because I had that too. I joined Tesla. It was my last in-house role. And I show up and there's all these contracts. I hadn't worked in automotive before. And I'm looking at it and it's all, there's some provisions in there that I was clueless. There's things relating to quality and how they do stuff. And I go get one of the lawyers and I was like, would you please just walk me through this? And we literally spent maybe an hour and a half. I took super detailed notes in the comments. And for the whole time I worked there, I was pulling that thing out just because, wait, what does he do again? So it sounds like a similar experience.
Very similar experience. Yeah, the step-by-step walkthrough. So in the beginning, it was maybe like essentially side by side in the virtual world, because I joined during the pandemic, putting it up on Teams and looking provision by provision. What does this mean? What do we care about? What do we not care about? Sometimes my litigator mind sees go flashbacks to those disputes that I've seen. Oh, we've got to focus on this and pay attention to this. Turns out that maybe in this world, it doesn't really matter so much. So you learn to
Yes.
let go. So yeah, it was definitely like the very hands-on. And then from that very first detailed review, then I figure out, okay, maybe how do you apply that to other contracts? And my boss is always just a team's call away for me to go back to when I have questions of things, as I still do today, because I think it's a constant journey and a lot of learning that has to happen. I think you just have to be comfortable knowing that with any contract that comes, there might be some provision that you're not familiar with, but you can figure it out through whatever resources are out there or based on some similar experience that you've had before. There are ways to figure out and approach every contract. And I think with a lot of things, it's just building the confidence to know that you can figure it out.
And I think that's exactly it. It's that confidence. And what I see is a lot of newer folks who haven't been working with contracts get overwhelmed by it. I know that's how I was when I started out too. It's like, I have no idea how I'm supposed to write any of it. And the first time you mark up a contract, or at least this was me as a junior associate, and it comes back basically 100% wrong. I did every single thing improperly. And you get there and you're looking at it like, how do you go from that to better to where you actually have worthwhile edits and worthwhile comments? What I think is really interesting is the different journeys people take from that starting point to get there and having different resources and things like that. Now, do you work with different teams in your company? How do you help them with their contract needs? Because often in-house counsel are working with either engineering teams or quality or privacy or whoever it is, and we're always training people in contracts. So that's a big interest of mine too, is how do we as lawyers or senior contract managers help our teams learn more?
As in two ways. So we actually have trainings. Like sometimes we will just sit with our purchasing, sales, quality and say, okay, let's break down what's a contract. It's not quite that basic, but similar to what I learned on the job of walking through the key provisions. Here's what we should all be thinking about. Here's what they mean. Here's why with any kind of contract that comes in across my desk, if someone says, please review this, there's often from business colleagues, let's just throw it to legal and legal will sort it out, but you can't review contracts in a vacuum. So I will then maybe have a call and say, okay, let's just talk to me about the business side of this. Why does this matter? What's the history here? What's the context? And then walk them through what matters in the contracts in relation to that history and context. And that's actually one of the parts that I find most fulfilling is that ability to both educate the team, but then also work together because again, the legal part doesn't exist alone and the business part doesn't exist alone. So how do you find that balance so that you're able to meet what the business's needs are? I love that process.
I love that too. And I've had a similar dynamic. So I worked in renewable energy for a lot of my in-house years. And we had the regulatory folks who were follow the rules. And then there were the commercial teams who were let's push the envelope and get more deals and make more money. And one of the fun things was similar to that, where it's instead of the business to business, it was lawyer to lawyer. And I would advocate for my business team and say, let's help push the envelope, but within your rules. And then the regulatory folks would say, let's figure out how to comply with the rules and help you push the envelope. And that internal negotiation is it's just such a fun puzzle to solve with your teammates.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That's when the problem solving skills kick in and found that sometimes I think maybe at a high level, understand what's happening. And then it can take just a few more of those questions and really digging to say, oh, this is what we really care about. This is really the heart of the issue. And here's how, where maybe my suggested revision doesn't apply that. It doesn't apply or it's not helpful. And to then, again, that sort of melding of the business and legal is really where the magic happens.
Yeah, and I think that's the real fun stuff. That's why even when I was in law firms at MoFo, I always like to work with the business team. So if the client had internal legal, I'd be like, oh, I think somebody else should do that. I'll work with the ones that don't have any in-house lawyers, because it was just so much more fun to get in the weeds with it as opposed to the technical legal. And of course, that's not everybody. There's a lot of people who love the technical legal of contracts and financings and corporate M&A. It's a different kind of beast than the commercial stuff I do, but there's something for everyone with contracts.
Yeah, full of fun. All good.
One question I want to ask you, because you have this unique experience of working in Japan and with a Swedish parent company, and you're an American. Can you speak to folks who maybe wherever they are and they're trying to learn how to negotiate contracts cross border? Because it's
Mhm.
a little bit different than just negotiating with somebody down the street where there's no cross-border issues, no complexity that way. Focusing on how did you figure out some of the international aspects of that?
Great question. Something I maybe should mention in addition to my role. So based in Japan, but I cover the Asia region, so not including China. So that means I'm doing work for Japan, India, Thailand, Malaysia, the Philippines. Always leave something off of the list, but lots of different countries in Asia. So yeah, the cross border is happening a lot. At a high level, just having a general understanding of what the culture is in the region. How do people communicate? I read a couple of books. There's one, The Culture Map. It was just eye-opening about the differences between cultures, Western versus Eastern, and how things are relative, how people communicate, just on these all different kind of spectrums of different factors of how people can communicate. And just having a general understanding of that is helpful. Then, if it's a sophisticated, high impact potential contract, having specialists in those regions. So we have a fairly lean legal team, and that means that I'm relying on people in some of these countries to advise. I can tell you what matters to the business. I can tell you the legal, our risk appetite, so to speak, but I need you to help me understand what can we expect from our counterparty when they say this, what do they really mean? Type of thing. So a lot of it is just like learning contracts, learning the culture, learning the business culture, learning what happens in negotiations. And then I can also rely on my local business teams in each of these regions where someone in Japan saying something and it sounds the same in Thailand, but it doesn't actually mean the same thing. Being able to have that cultural awareness is really important. And then also just how to interpret what you're hearing so that you can maximize to your advantage and essentially get what you want.
Those were such great points because those are things that I picked up when I started doing cross-border work was working with local counsel. The trick was asking the right question, because if we didn't ask the right question, they weren't necessarily volunteering the answer. I don't know that I ever mastered that. It's an ongoing challenge because we'd ask the question 3 different ways and we get one answer, but as soon as we tweaked it another way, some other fact came out. "Oh, I didn't know you meant that. Oh, we're gonna change our original answers all this way." It's always one of the harder aspects of it, but also to me, the more fun aspects of it because
Mhm.
it's another layer of complexity on top of what's already a very complex and nuanced situation.
Yeah, definitely.
So, if you had advice for people who are newer to learning contracts, kind of looking back where you were, what kind of things do you think worked best for you and could work for others in their journey of learning contracts?
And if you're wanting to plant this, but sign up for how to contract and fire, but of course. Really, I mean, that's essentially what worked for me is it was naturally finding people on LinkedIn who were talking about these topics about contracts, just really exposing yourself. So joining webinars and seminars, and there is a lot of information that is out there and available and accessible. And if it's something that you have an interest in or passion in,
Mhm.
just grab it, grab onto it, reach out to people who are the thought leaders sharing this information because I, like yourself, I mean, just very open to wanting to share and encourage other people. Contracts aren't scary. You can learn this, you can figure it out. It's just you have to have the right information, the right resources. yeah, there's definitely information out there and ways to get a hold of it, all of this information.
Yeah, I agree. There's so much. Even 10 years ago, there wasn't anything like there is now in terms of the availability of information and the diversity of viewpoints, because we have people who are coming from more of an academic perspective and they'll talk about the case laws, the different trends in the different states. But for some of us who are more generalists and just in house, we need the how do you deal with this provision today in the way that we have to deal with it. So I really appreciate the reference to all the resources out there. Thanks again for the plug for how to contract, of course. That's great. So wonderful. Thank you so much for being on this episode, and we'll continue to stay in touch and appreciate it so much.
Great. Thank you, Laura. It's a pleasure.